Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the IWReads Book Club. I'm Julie Gunlock, and I'm here with Ginny Gentle. She's the director of the Education Freedom Center. Today, we're thrilled to be joined by Abigail Shrier to discuss her new book, Bad Therapy, Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up. Here's my tabbed, there we go, look at that. Abigail Shrier, for those who don't know, and most people do know, Abigail Shrier received the Barbara Olson Award for Excellence and Independence in Journalism in 2021. Her best-selling book, Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, was named a best book by The Economist and The Times. It has been translated into 10 languages. I can't recommend it enough. Ginny, I'm going to send it over to you. I know there's a few technical issues you want to go over.
Yes, before we get started, I want to point out a few features to anyone who might be new to the IWReads events. We have a chat room over on the right side of your screen where you can join the discussion with other attendees and my IWF colleagues who will have the word team next to their names. If you don't see the chat room, click chat on the bottom right corner of the screen. Honestly, on my screen, I had to click more and then chat, but it might just be that you click chat on the bottom right corner of the screen. Next to the chat room tab, there's a questions tab. So if you have a question for Abigail, and I know we all have questions for Abigail, that's why we're here, please post it in the questions tab. You can give other attendees questions bumps by hitting the up arrows. That'll help us find the questions faster. And there's also a polls tab where one of my colleagues has posted some questions for you to answer. I encourage everyone to take the polls. Towards the end of our time today, we'll be announcing names to win 3 copies of the book. And in order to win, you must be present during the drawing at the end of today's events. The books will be mailed to our door prize winners. So look forward to that.
Great. With the technical stuff out of the way, we're thrilled that we have the opportunity to hear the author herself. Welcome, Abigail, to the stage.
Can you hear me?
Yes. There you go. Hey, Abigail.
Welcome. It's exciting.
Hi, it's great to talk to all of you.
We are really thrilled to have you here. I'm not sure personally, I've seen more excitement from the staff and also from a lot of our listeners and viewers about you coming. I think people are just thrilled that you've written this book and that you're here to talk to us today.
Thank you so much. You know, the people I write for are the parents. I mean, that's who I write for, and that's my favorite group to talk to. So I'm really, really thrilled to talk to you all.
Well, we have a lot of parents listening today. This is an IWF event, but also an IW network event. And we have so many members of the network that are parents and are very concerned about this issue. Many of them have experienced much of what you've written about and in your previous book as well. So let's get started. I'll start the questions rolling. Just a real basic question here. Tell us about the book and why you wanted to write it.
Sure. So I actually started out with a different hypothesis. I sold it to a publisher, and here was the hypothesis. I noticed that the rising generation was in the greatest distress. They had the highest anxiety and depression rates, suicidality, suicidal self-harm, all kinds of metrics. They seem to not be really struggling. And the question was why? You know, I'm a mom. I have 3 kids in this generation. And I really wanted to know, why were they in so much distress? And I originally thought it had something to do with the way they were being raised, because it wasn't clear, you know, until the pandemic was relatively recently. And they were in distress long before that. And I thought it maybe had something to do with the way they were being raised. And then I became aware. I went into the public school system and I thought, okay, well, let's see what they're doing. Let's see what everyone's doing to support these kids. And what I found was a generation so awash in therapy, in what I call bad therapy. Bad therapy is any therapy that makes existing symptoms worse or introduces new symptoms. And I saw a generation so awash in therapy that the highest rates of diagnosis, the highest rates of treatment of both therapy in school and out of school, the highest rates of psych meds, and they seem to be doing the worst. So why weren't the kids whose wellness we obsessed over, why weren't they the picture of wellness? Instead, they were the picture of despair.
All right. So you said that you went into writing the book because you had some thoughts about the way children were being raised. And you do talk about that in the book. You talk about therapy and you talk about schools, but you talk about parenting. and this idea of gentle parenting and how that might harm the development of children. And I have to be honest, the first time I encountered that was maybe around 2009. I took my baby to the playground to play in a baby swing, and this toddler just took off, just started running down the hill, and a mom called after her, "Sophie, make good choices." I thought, what the heck? Why is she saying make good choices? Like, why didn't she tell her child just to come back or to stop? What was going on with parenting that produced the make good choices kind of language that we use now?
Right. So to a large extent, we turned our parenting over to experts. We put the experts in charge of our parenting, and you'll hear this kind of stilted language all the time. "Oh, I see you're having some big feelings." That effort to constantly recognize and affirm a child's feelings in a non-judgmental way and then present a child with options, that's a therapeutic method known as gentle parenting. And it usually is propounded mostly by therapists, a lot of psychologists and sometimes neuropsychologists. And they have convinced, unfortunately, a generation of parents that they don't know what they're doing, that we have to ape all of their, methods. And honestly, the results are unimpressive. You see a generation that's so dysregulated, that so can't control its own behavior, and is very often violent even. I mean, they lash out and hit their parents. And here's the problem: when you can't control a child, what do you end up doing? Well, parents who are afraid to say no, afraid to discipline, even send a kid to his room, they're afraid to do that because they're afraid of inflicting emotional injury. What do they end up doing? They end up regulating the child with psych meds. They end up getting them a diagnosis and medication because it becomes the only way to control them.
Well, and those toddlers and babies end up becoming high schoolers, because now that baby that I had in 2009 is a high schooler, and she says that her classmates can't regulate themselves, and they're regularly asking teachers for extensions and for accommodations, and the teachers are like, "Just stop whining," and then they're so offended. "How could you tell me no and to stop?" And so, we're wondering, what should parents have been doing different all these years to make sure that these kids are showing up for school, knowing how to listen, how to behave, how to respect their teacher's authority, and not have to go on psych meds in order to do that?
So I wrote the book in part so that parents would stop getting pushed around. And what I did was they always claim that this is the best psychological, intervention for children. Actually, it's not. And so I explained why, and I tried to provide all the research and really the sort of armaments for parents to fight this battle, to defend really what we know how to do, which is raise our kids. See, going back to the 1960s now, we've known that kids need parental authority. They need to be raised with authority, which doesn't mean cruelty. It doesn't mean unloving. You can be as loving and affectionate as you want. It means parents set the rules. Parents know best, and they set the rules for the kids. You can ask a kid what he or she wants, but ultimately parents are in charge. And that produces over and over, this is one of the most replicated studies, kids who have the least mental health problems in terms of anxiety and depression. They are the happiest, most successful children, and they tend to be ultimately kids with the best relationships with their parents. Now, this is the opposite of what all the experts are saying today. But actually, there's wonderful psychological research backing this up. It's what kids need, and it's what we're not giving them.
We are constantly, as parents, told to ignore our own instincts, and really kind of even ignore the way our moms raised us. Right. And one of the funniest examples, I know I need to move on, but I have to kind of talk about this gentle parenting a little bit. I had a friend who told me that she was really trying to get her daughter to eat healthier. And this was a very young little girl, probably 6 or 7 years old. And she said, "Well, I read that you have to introduce a vegetable 10 times before they'll try it." And she said, and she just won't try it. She just won't try it. And this mom was really trying hard to adopt these sort of expert rules. And I said, did you try punishing her or yelling at her? I mean, I'm kidding. But I was like, my mom would never have stood for me refusing vegetables 10 times, right? And so I think that's part of the problem, is that everything we sort of know about kids and know sort of how we were raised, we're told to reject that because the experts tell us to. Right. How do you navigate that? Do you tell people don't listen to experts at all? Or, at what time do experts come in and are useful?
Right. When a child has a severe problem.
Yeah.
right? There are severe problems. There is severe anorexia. There is, serious, depression. I mean, there are kids who have these things, and you may need a therapist, and you may even need psych meds. And then the question is, when and what kind, and that sort of thing. But outside of that, unfortunately, we're letting, look, let's go back to gentle parenting for a second. Where's the proof that this works?
Right.
If you go to any parenting group of gentle parents, they will talk, they sound like abuse victims. They will say, my child hit, kicked, slapped me. What do how do I help him understand that this is not a good choice? I mean, they're afraid of inflicting trauma, and they let loose a generation of kids in schools that are often violent and so out of control that a teacher can't control them.
Right.
And the kids have never heard the word no. I mean, it's honestly, it's a disaster, and parents knew it was a disaster, but what they didn't always have is the proof. So I tried to get that together for, in one place for parents, so they could take this document and say, I knew it. And one of my favorite comments I got recently from a mom was, she said to me, today for the first time after reading your book, I punished my son without guilt.
Nice.
And the reason I liked that so much was, I don't tell you when to punish a child or how. That's your business.
Right.
But the fact that she was doing what she thought she should do without guilt for the first time, without fear that it would inflict permanent trauma, which was never true. And that made me very happy for her and for her son.
That is a great story. I want to really quickly, Jenny, go on to this question I have, which is related to parenting. And I know we've got other areas we want to explore, but this kind of straddles parenting and schools. Over the years, we have seen schools take over more and more what used to be parenting rules or parenting roles, right? You can drop your kid off at 6 a.m. for before care, and you can pick them up really late from after care. They can get 2 full meals at school, and they get a pretty heavy snack. And they actually had a pilot program for school dinner program. There are after school programs for enrichment. The sports programs, they're very sophisticated sports programs through schools. Now there's wellness centers. The thing I want to ask is, are parents at least partially responsible for some of the fact that these schools have so reached into children's private lives and family lives? Because they're doing so much already. I mean, schools have become social service centers. Where do you think should parents start to reclaim more of their basic roles?
Absolutely. But I think that parents were really undermined, and parents were really made to feel really insecure. And these who can oppose wellness? It's hard to blame parents for not knowing that preventive mental health, the stuff that flies under the label of preventive mental health, has been completely ineffective. It certainly hasn't bolstered mental health, but in many cases, it's also counterproductive, meaning it introduces problems. And I wrote the book in order to arm parents with that knowledge so that these so-called experts wouldn't push them around. But there's something else too. I wrote the book, I described why this feeling, based on the psychological research, the constant feelings focus, the constant push through things like social emotional learning to think about your pain, focus on your pain, now is counterproductive. Now, teachers will claim and counselors will claim, well, it's just asking about feelings. That's a neutral act. You can share good feelings, happy feelings. Well, of course you can, but you can't teach regulation if you're going to talk about the good stuff, right? We're not worried about a child experiencing too much joy. So there's not much to talk about. So it always goes negative. Now tell me about a time when you felt angry, left out, insulted, hurt, neglected. So it's always returning to this rumination on past pain, which is the number one symptom of depression, this endless rumination on past pain. And then, of course, naturally, whose job is it to keep a child safe?
Right.
The parent. So inevitably, it ends up with a criticism of a parent. And just as I predicted, not only I show why all of these interventions in schools are likely to make kids sadder, more depressed, more anxious, and more alienated from their parents. But while I was writing the book, what I didn't know was that 2 sets of researchers, one in England and one in Australia, were looking into the same thing. They were looking into social emotional techniques, wellness techniques, anti-bullying studies, one in Australia and one in England. In England, the researcher is Folks, Foulkes, I think, and in Australia, I believe it's Harvey. These came out after I was done with the book, but what they found was exactly as I predict in the book, that they had a control group, and then they had kids who went through this program, and in each case, the kids ended up sadder, more anxious, more depressed, and more alienated from mom and dad.
A good friend of mine texted me today, all excited about this event, and she said that her daughter would always tell her she felt worse after her mental health days. So they have mental health days in Orange County, Florida schools, and she would feel worse. So the gut instincts that parents and the kids are having around these are right. You're saying that's
right. And it's exactly what the research would have predicted if any of these people had bothered to look at it. Okay. Yeah. Why? Because sitting with and revisiting your sad emotions is the symptom of depression. It will make you less well-regulated. Mm-hmm. By the way, it also makes it harder to achieve a difficult task. That's why basketball coaches in halftime don't say, okay, now let's talk about your parents' divorce. What do they say? They say, let's focus on the task. Forget your pain. Forget your heartache. Let's focus on the job ahead. And it turns out that's the best way to accomplish any task. And yes, that involves a certain amount of repression. You aren't always dealing with your feelings. It doesn't mean never deal with the feelings. It's saying never do it before your algebra test, unless you absolutely need to, because you have a test to do. You have a team to play for. You have things we want these kids to do. It's so important for them to develop skills and hobbies and friends and all that stuff. And sitting around in a, faux therapy session in the middle of the school day, I want you to know, and this is the important thing, it doesn't help the child who's gone through a serious traumatic event or potentially traumatic event. It will not help him to have his school counselor dabble in his pain before his history test. And it doesn't help the child who doesn't need it, because it will only bring her low. Mm-hmm. So it's really helping no one.
Right. So this crop dusting, as you describe it, of mental health across the schools, across the culture is hurting, not helping. I know we're going to have tons of questions about SEL, about survey, about schools. Like, this is something that people are really passionate about. And so we'll loop back to those issues. I wanted to make sure I got in a smartphone question. I'm on a bit of a anti-smartphone kick. My 15-year-old has a flip phone. My 13-year-old does not have a phone. I had a landline installed if she needs to reach me when I'm away. I'm really wary of these smartphones. You pose the question in the book, why do parents continue to gift $1,000 phones to kids knowing full well that they are linked to a rise in depression, anxiety, and self-harm? And then, of course, short attention span, insomnia, severe anxiety. There's so many problems with these smartphones. So why are parents continuing to do that? I guess there's a collective action issue. But if parents...
I don't think there is. I mean, I have to tell you, what's the problem? Parents don't feel comfortable asserting their own authority. Okay. The problem is deeper than the phone. That's why we didn't take them away. Look, this is old news. We've known for 8 years now that smartphones were harmful for kids, right? They spread, I wrote about it in my last book, how they spread the transgender contagion among transgender identification contagion among teen girls. So why were they continuing to give them? Because they were worried about letting the emotional damage if their child felt left out. And let me tell you something, they got zero support from the mental health organizations, zero. There was no warning, as there would have been for smoking or anything else, about social media in kids. Why? Because the mental health experts weren't actually behaving as you would if you wanted to safeguard kids' mental health. They had other objectives, like their own styles of treatment. So I think, smartphones there's no question social media is an accelerant for a lot of the problems. But I think the problem, look, we've had adolescent mental health decline since the 1950s. It's been a problem for a long time in this country. It's because we're not giving kids a healthy life. Mm-hmm. And now we're pouring mental health resources into an unhealthy life. Well, that's not going to fix it. Do I think we should take smartphones out of the schools? Absolutely. Do I think smartphones are generally a bad idea with kids? Yeah, I do. But is it going to solve, did we just solve the mental health crisis by saying we should get rid of them? No, I don't think so. These are long-term trends. And I'll give you just one statistic. In 2016, 1 in 6 American children between the ages of 2 and 8 already had a mental health or behavioral diagnosis. Those kids weren't on smartphones. They're not on smartphones now.
They're on
but they definitely weren't on 2016. Okay. So this is a long-term trend, and you can't just snap your fingers and blame big tech. And by the way, I don't like big tech, and they've caused a lot of problems, and they made a lot of their mental health problems worse. But the start of fixing this has to come from parental authority and giving kids a healthier life. Okay. And that means independence. It means connection to extended family, people who really love them and they love back over time. Okay. Not just the hired coach or expert. We need to, and giving them a sense of capacity, what they can do, giving them right and wrong, and then trusting them to act on it, not chasing behind them saying, use good choices, but actually teaching them right from wrong, and then holding their behavior to high standards. That's the good stuff. And we know how to do it, and we just need to go back to doing it.
What do you think about some schools banning cell phones? I assume you sort of approve of these sort of bans, but also the state of Florida just passed a bill. I think you can't be on social media until you're 13. What do you think of these efforts? Also, sort of, not exact. I mean, I know they want to ban TikTok because of national security concerns, but how do you think about these sort of government actions to sort of regulate this stuff?
Is it going to fix it? Do you think it's going to fix it?
I think truly, I think it is a great thing to have a partnership between schools and parents saying there's no sort of changing the culture. We don't approve of
taking the phones out of schools is such a no-brainer. I don't know what to say. Why are they on their phones in the middle of the school day? It should never have been allowed. And I want to know what all those counselors who are going along with it, all the school psychologists who are going, what were they possibly thinking okaying this? Right? I mean, they also okayed the mental health surveys, obviously, which are a disaster for kids, as I show it in the book. But they went along with it. They shouldn't have. Of course, they don't need their phones in the middle of the school day. Okay, so of course I'm in favor of that. Do I think the government is going to come into our rescue and magically say no? Look, kids are very sophisticated on technology. They're much more sophisticated than their parents. Okay. So at a certain point, you have to give them a sense of right and wrong and be able to trust them, which means they need parental authority and they need consequences. Okay. But if we ban TikTok, it'll just move on to something else. We can try to hysterically chase after the good apps and learn about the bad apps, or we can develop kids who are strong and then decide how and when to trust them. Right. And I think that, look, my kids don't have smartphones. I'm not Pollyannish about the harms of smartphones whatsoever. But do I think that that we can just blame big tech and be done with it? No.
Yeah, and kids are quite creative. Like they'll use their Chromebook as they would use a smartphone. And so, are we going to get schools to ban Chromebooks? I hope so.
Exactly.
But that's going to take a while too.
Exactly my point. And let me tell you something. It's so hard for all of us. Look, the schools have been undermining parents like crazy because any guidelines we try to set, they undermine by giving them Chromebooks. And so do I think that Jonathan Haidt's effort is wonderful and should be commended and we should get behind? Of course. Of course, we need to take the phones out of the schools. Of course. But do I think that fully explains what we're seeing? No, I don't. I think these are long-term trends that social media in part accelerated. But I think that it's not. Nobody's going to solve this for us.
Okay, so a consistent theme that we're hearing is parental authority, like parents. Do your job. They're your kids. They're yours. Don't let the experts get between you and your child. And I'm wondering if you can kind of provide more insight into where that's happening. I know for me, I started out as one of those parents that turned to an expert for everything, for vision therapy, for occupational therapy, for social skills, for dialectical behavior therapy. Like I'm one of the parents you write about in the book, but possibly because my daughter really did need a lot of interventions. But now I'm one of those parents who's just saying no to medical experts. So if they're handing my teens those screeners at the pediatrician's office, I'm saying no. And I'm certainly saying no that I'm not going to leave so that you can talk to my child in private. And then if we're in a therapy that's driving a wedge between my child and me, we're out. But that's unusual, right? Like parents aren't saying, parents don't know that they can say no to the pediatrician, right?
Yeah.
So how, like, can you give some more examples of like tactics that parents can take? Like, where can they start saying no? If they're hearing you, oh, I need to assert my authority. Like, where do they need to assert their authority?
So two things. If you could handle it, your child can probably handle it. So if you could get through a math test, even though you were nervous about math, probably your daughter doesn't need an untimed, an accommodation in school. Now, if you have a child who really needs an accommodation, for good, by all means, get it. But the question you need to ask yourself is, will this make my child stronger? Because I am flooded right now with parents writing in to say the worst thing I did was get my child an accommodation. All they did was abuse it, and it used it as an excuse to reach the standards I knew they could reach. I knew they were capable of, and now they'll never reach them. Mm-hmm. And we have been obsessing over children's happiness, and we have completely neglected the question of, am I making my child stronger? Because if you make your child stronger, they will be happier in the end. If they they have a sense of efficacy in the world, that will make them happier. But there's something else too. There's a great statistic. Came out of Jean Twenge's book, Generations. Not my research, it's hers. But she found that even though the mental health was worst for teenage boys, even though the mental health was worse overall for teenage girls, teenage boys from liberal families tended to have worse mental health than teenage girls from conservative ones. Now that's not social media. Teen girls are on a lot more social media. Okay. All teen girls. But here's the thing. They're being raised differently. It shows that it's an environmental problem. It's the sort of ways we're raising them and the sort of context we're giving them. And that includes our neurotic hovering, not asserting our authority. See, when you assert your authority when you're kids, when you say this is right and wrong, if your behavior doesn't meet this conduct, I'm sorry, there are going to be consequences. I will punish you in whatever way, is appropriate, because I expect you could do a lot better. And that's not acceptable. You can't just haul off and hit someone you're angry with, that sort of thing. Well, you teach your child that, then you can trust them in the world. And then guess what? They get the benefits of independence. Now they have no benefits, no psychic benefits of independent activity. And by the way, independence is not saying, you get to choose your own high school, or you can choose whether to dye your hair green or purple. On the one hand, that's a kind of independence that they don't really have the judgment to assert, and you're putting them in charge. And on the other hand, whether to dye their hair green or purple, that's such a trivial kind of independence, right? When I say independence, they need independence to take a risk that will have consequences, that can develop strength, like a walk around the neighborhood by themselves.
Well, Abigail, if I could touch on that, you're talking about free range parenting, which I have been devoted to for years and years. And I've been kind of curious. I've written a lot about free range parenting. I love Lenore Skenazy and all that she writes. Yeah. She's so great.
She's great.
She's helped me out of a lot of times where I've been afraid to do something. And I've raised my kids with that method. And they're very healthy. But I worry, and I wonder if you worry with COVID, suddenly we're Zoom butlering our kids, as Mary Catherine Ham said. I did not make that. Zoom butlering, such a great phrase. But as we're Zoom butlering our kids, we notice, oh my gosh, what is going on in these schools, right? And suddenly we realize, oh my gosh, it's not the white van, right, pulling up and snatching our kids, but it's these influencing sort of forces, like the SEL, like all this stuff that's in the schools. Suddenly we're like, wait a minute. So I worry a little bit, because I feel like that makes us all want to hover a little bit more. I think people have been hovering a little bit more.
Absolutely. And there's good reason for it. And I understand it. But here's what I want you to know. So why don't I use the term free range, even though I love Lenore Skenazy and I love free range parenting? Why don't I use the term? Because I've seen it really abused by people who say they're doing free range parenting while obsessively surveilling their kids. obsessively. And that I don't think was the intention behind range parenting whatsoever. No, but I think it's a wonderful, wonderful movement and project. So what do you do? Well, here, I'll give you an example. My kids know, for instance, what our values are in our home, what we think, and including about things like SEL. That it makes you sad to sit around and talk about your pain, that we all have pain, and that it's a terrible project and a bad idea in practice. However, whatever the theory behind it, I can tell you that in practice, it's absolutely backfiring. It's counterproductive. Okay. So why do I mention this? Because now I don't have to obsessively hover as my kids go into SEL. They know our values. They know what I think, and I'm ready to discuss it with them when they come home. Mm-hmm. And as I say in the book, I'm far from the perfect parent, and I am no parenting expert. Okay. I have young kids. Who knows how they'll turn out? I'm not claiming to be a parenting expert. But here's what I want parents to know. We have not done a good job in the last generation teaching our kids our values, passing them on. How do I know that? Because kids, even 2 decades ago, were starting to emerge on college campus, not believing in free speech, not thinking free speech was important.
Right.
Why do they not know why free speech is important in America? Why it's a treasure that we have? Because we didn't pass on our values to them. So we left them as prey to all kinds of activists and mental health professionals and all sorts of people who are ready to pass on their values and their ideas to them. And that we need to stop right now. It's the easiest. It's so cheap. It's the easiest thing and cheapest thing you'll ever do for your kids is pass on your own values to them. So I think you can hover a lot less if you give your kids your values.
It's such great commentary. Ginny, I feel like I want to be selfish and then ask more and more questions that we have, but we do have an audience. I think this is a good time to break to audience questions. Ginny, do you have anything you want to ask before we do that?
I do have one, because I love this idea of parental authority, pushing back on the experts, asserting ourselves, and taking care of things ourselves. But I'm a little confused when you talk about cutting in the book, because that sounds really scary, and it's a real trend among kids. Like we're Gen X, that eating disorders were pervasive, and now it's more cutting or gender dysphoria or some combination of all three. But you indicate that maybe parents don't need to worry too much about cutting. So I'm just wondering, as parents are reading this book, like at what point do they need to get serious and involve experts? Like, how do you advise parents to make that decision? And I'm pretty sure your message wasn't like ignore cutting.
No. So here's what I'll say, and I talked to a cognitive behavioral therapist, Roger McFillin, about this, but here's what I'll say. It's not ignore this or ignore that, right? All sorts of things can be serious, or they can be a cry for attention and a way to strong-arm parents.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that behavior that may just be trying to get to your attention, remember that your attention, you're feeding your kid into a mental health pipeline, that comes with a lot of harms and risks too. So if you think what a kid is doing, whatever that behavior is just trying to manipulate you. I had somebody, I think it was Glenn Beck, asked me the other day about, asked me on the air about suicide in his family. And at some point realizing that he was so worried about his own children. It was an incredibly wonderful thing he shared on air, that he was so worried with his own kids that, of course, his own kids could use his worry against him. In a certain sense, that's what the therapist had told him. He's weaponizing that against you, right? And that's a concern too. Meaning, what I'm saying is, don't ignore signs of suicidality or anything like that. I would never say that. But what I'm saying is that a lot of these things are contagions, and they do get worse by applying hyper focus on them. And they certainly can get worse if you shove a kid into a mental health pipeline automatically at the first sign of sadness or despair or a little bit of phobia or a little bit of anxiety, right? So all those things can make the existing problem worse.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is it so severe that I have to?
Mm.
And if I don't have to, can I maybe make alterations in the environment first? Before I put a child on stimulants for ADHD, maybe I can do other things to help with attention.
Get a trampoline.
Before I put on a kid on an antidepressant or sign her up for therapy, maybe there are other things I can do, like get her involved in a sports team or whatever it may be. I'm just saying that parents have to keep their heads, right? And we're all, believe me, I get it. There's nothing scarier than watching your child go through anything hard. But what I want them to know is feeding them into a mental health care pipeline or therapy or, or even giving them a diagnosis. Well, those come with risks as well.
Okay, Abigail, I'm telling you, there are so many questions coming in, and I'm going to start these off. This one's really interesting, and I want to preface this by saying I was talking to a friend of mine, and she was explaining that, sometimes one of her children will say something like, we were always moving because they're in the military. We were always moving, and we always had to move around my birthday, and all my siblings got birthday parties, and I never did. And she said the siblings chimed in and said, that's not true. We all remember that time we went to this, we did this, right? And so it's interesting how siblings can be sort of helpful in sort of pulling you out of the sadness, right? They can just call you on your own baloney.
Absolutely.
So this question is, this is why I like this question. And this is by Leah Cagle. She says, do you have any insights on bad therapy, including school counseling, on an only child? Are only children typically more prone to sort of depression or sadness?
Oh, I haven't seen any evidence of that. I'm not sure that I know the literature on that, but here's what I'll say. Siblings, extended family, that's good. That's really good stuff. Grandparents, there you go. And here's the difference between that and a school counselor or a therapist for loneliness. Grandma's going to listen to your heartache and then say, now go play.
Yeah.
Now go play. How many therapists will say, you're done here. No need to keep your standing appointment.
I can't agree with that more. I actually, as you're saying that, I'm like, oh my God, my mother says that. That's nice. Go play. This question is from Hadley. She said, I saw surveys showing that working class parents put more emphasis on obedience in children today. Curious what Abigail observes about socioeconomic and class on this issue.
So people always ask me, one of the questions I got a lot was, is this just an upper middle class problem or a middle class problem? To some extent, okay? But the poor kids always end up getting hit the worst. The working class and poor kids end up getting hit the worst because they don't have the resources to remediate as easily. Now, when you said about working class, remember I wrote the last book was about a social contagion spread largely among middle class and upper middle class girls. And here's what I want parents to know. Why? Because in almost every case, part of the story there, almost every case, those girls had a therapist or school counselor that helped them come to the revelation that they were transgender. Okay. And by the way, these weren't gender therapists. These were vanilla psychodynamic psychotherapists or school counselors who were there to talk about a kid's anxiety. And when they were done talking about mom, or their exam stress, or their friend stress, they then moved on to gender.
Yeah.
So do, working class parents have the advantage? They're more comfortable asserting their own authority. That's a big advantage.
Yeah.
Because it's been deemed unsophisticated by the wealthier classes.
It's terrible. This is from Nicole Brillant. How do you get parents to realize they are allowing this to happen or enabling this? A lot of people seem to be on autopilot these days. When you speak out, many don't know what you're talking about or think it's not happening to them. How does this become a sort of a wider concern?
So people sometimes ask me, like, why don't you talk about, political policy in the book or in your books in general, or religion or politics? I don't talk about any of those things. Okay. First of all, because I'm interested in culture. I just am. But I try to evaluate things by their own lights or specifically to help moms like that one. And here's what I mean. You don't need to know, although there's been really, really interesting work done by people like James Lindsay on tracing the roots of things like SEL, okay? But you don't need to know all of the origins of social emotional learning to know that it's not good for kids, it's bad for kids. And here's why. Because I went into the psychological research and showed that these methods will make sadder kids, more anxious kids, more incapacitated kids, kids who feel like they can't do for themselves. Okay. So I try to evaluate things by their own lights. And if you look, even according to psychological research, these things aren't good. Because sitting around and telling you that you need an expert presiding over you and teaching you how to emotionally regulate, you're going to end up with a generation who feels it cannot handle its own problems, even mundane ones. And that's what we've got. A generation that feels mom has to call if I'm having a problem with my boss. Literally, my boss at work. That's a catastrophe. This is America. Okay. What happened to daring do? What happened to the sense that we could go out there and do and make this country and make the world a better place? Right? Instead, we've got kids taking mental health days off of work. And when I say kids, I really mean adults, young adults, crying for mental health days off of work. Kids who don't need it, but they don't know they don't need it.
Abigail, I don't know if you saw the video. It sort of went viral of there was a protest, a sit-in, and a girl got up and actually called 911 because they wouldn't let her go to the bathroom. And I'm like, you can't even protest like they used to. I mean, she was so fragile that she called 911 because, if she left the room, she, wouldn't be allowed back in. I mean, it's just crazy. But
that's right. And this is a classic iatrogenic effective therapy. Iatrogenic meaning when the healer introduces harm. A classic, researched effective therapy is treatment dependency, feeling like I can't do for myself. I always have to check in with an expert. This is what we are inducing by obsessing over kids' mental health and sending in armies of counselors to preside over their personal lives. We're sending the message to kids. You can't handle your own personal lives. If you have a conflict with a friend, you can't work it out on your own. You need to call in an adult or a so-called expert because at 12, 13, 14, you can't possibly handle that on your own.
I'm trying to find, I have like so many bookmarks in your book, but you talked about that. I'd love it if you could expand on that a little. You talked about that the harm that the sort of the counselor, it makes it worse, right? Iatrogenic.
Yeah, that's
okay. That's the word I was looking for.
Right. Yes. I don't believe therapy is inherently bad, right?
Go ahead. But you said that the industry, right, therapy and counselors, that they're touchy about this. They get real itchy when you bring this up. That was chilling to me. That they're not even willing to examine.
Not the research academics who all know about this. And by the way, a lot of psychiatrists, academic psychiatrists have written to me and said, thank God you pointed this out. Okay. But the clinical therapists very often seem not either unaware that therapy can introduce harms or they deny it outright. Now, the idea that the only way to get over a past pain is by talking it out with a therapist, that's not true. That's not true. And for a lot of people, that will be counterproductive, as has been shown in many, studies that showed that burn victims, breast cancer survivors, first responders to catastrophe, they experienced more symptoms after therapy, because sometimes putting an event behind you and moving on will actually help you heal.
Well, there's a reason they call them the silent generation, right? I mean, these men who came back from World War II, and everyone says, oh, he never talked about it. You hear these examples all the time. I tried to talk to my grandpa about, Battle of the Bulge or whatever, and he won't talk about it. Right. I mean, I kept thinking about that in that chapter where what you just said, sometimes putting it behind you and not talking about it incessantly is a good thing.
I just saw a study, literally an article yesterday. I think it said that millennials believe that they're much better parents than their parents were. Well, that's a ridiculous thought, right? Not only from the proof that we're seeing already, but also if your children are not grown, If you have not raised children to sturdy adulthood, we have no idea the job you've done. And I count myself in that. Okay.
But Sophie's making good choices, so they must be parenting well.
You know what a parenting expert is in my book? Someone who has raised good people to adulthood. And I mean good citizens, people who can be relied upon by bosses, by, who are raising families, who are good spouses, who are good neighbors. Those are people you can ask for parenting advice of, right? See what the product is. But somebody I'm going to be in so much trouble because I asked my own question there, and everybody watching is like, "Could you get to my question?"
Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. Oh, this is a good one from Heather. Thoughts on Jonathan Haidt's new book? I think it's called The Anxious Generation.
I haven't read it, but I think he's been saying this for a long time, and I think it's such an important, good message, which is, we got to get the kids out of schools. Absolutely. And I really am 100% behind him, and I hope he's successful. I think that getting the phones out of schools, what were they doing there? This is such a no-brainer, honestly. That we, honestly, it really says a lot about the mental health staffs of schools that they went along with it for so long. But I would just, do I think that the smartphones and social media entirely explain the mental health of this generation? I wish that were true. It would be in some ways a very easy solve. But no, I do think it's deeper than that. I do think that when you see a generation, I'll just give you one example. They're having sex at lower rates. They're drinking less. They're socializing less. They're not driving. They are not in the game of life.
Right.
This is a generation that's opting out. Why would you opt out of that? Do you really believe that hanging out online is more fun than seeing friends in person? No, it's not true. That going to a party, anybody knows, yes, even teenagers, that going to a party is more fun than sitting at home with a screen. Okay. And you also know that sexual touching or any kind of romantic affection that's in person is a lot more fun than online porn.
Yes.
So why are these kids opting out? Because for the same reason that over half of them don't believe they're well.
Yeah.
They say less than half of the population of the rising generation believes its mental health is good. They are taking a sick day off of life because they don't feel up to its challenges. They have bought into the lie that they're all going around with trauma or a mental health diagnosis that's debilitating because we've let them be so diagnosed and we've let them buy into they can't on their own. They need a pill or an expert to fix them. And now we're seeing the fruits of it, a generation that doesn't believe it can.
Abigail, if you can, I know we've sort of hit our time limit with you, but I want to ask one quick question. Sure. This is from Wendy, and I think this is excellent. Do the state boards of licensing psychologists need to be updated? She goes on, is that something that you think policymakers should examine?
So what does that mean?
She said, sadly, if you suspect your child has ADD, you are forced into a psychologist for testing, which opens the door for them to try to make basic problems a weekly visit. So it sounds like the regulations right now make it really, again, open a door for this problem and really the presence of a psychologist to sort of do this to your child.
Okay, let me tell you a little bit of my prejudice here. Okay, and again, I'm not a policy person. I'm not very policy oriented, which I know is unhelpful. But here's my prejudice that I have. A teacher contacted me a couple years ago now from Texas, and he wanted me to know. We had a whole conversation. He was a fascinating guy, but what he wanted me to know, and he happened to have been gay, but it's relevant, and here's why. He wanted me to know that the gender statutes, don't talk about gender or sexuality with kids, that there had been a law passed in Texas. And what he wanted me to know was none of the teachers were following it. And the reason he wanted me to know was he thought, although he was a gay man, he thought, we're wasting these children's time on this stuff in class. I got into teaching to teach them. What on earth are we doing? He thought it was bad, but he also wanted me to know that the law that has been passed had done almost nothing to curtail what teachers were doing. And here's what I'll say. If your child is having trouble sitting still in class, if they're struggling, If it's not serious, so profound, start with seeing what you can do in their environment, taking away tech of a young kid, giving them chores. People have found behavioral modifications really helpful. What you can do without getting a diagnosis and starting down that path. If you have to get a diagnosis, if you have to go down that path, then you research the therapist as you would any surgeon. Because let me tell you, the amount of mischief that gets made in these offices that are completely unregulated and unsupervised, where no one's tracking whether symptoms have been made worse, unlike in a doctor's office, right? There are harms there too. Okay. So if you can avoid, now you might not be able to avoid going down the mental health pipeline. You might not. There are kids who need it. Okay. But I would start by seeing that we need to change the default, is what I'm saying. And the default can't be, oh, my teacher says he has ADHD. Gosh, she must know. No conflict of interest there.
Abigail, I can't thank you enough. Ginny and I have learned so much. I swear you are the best thing for parents since the invention of the mechanical swing. Honestly, I can't thank you enough for writing this book and your prior book. I think you have done so much for the parenting movement. Ginny, any final thoughts?
I just, close to half of the states, I think, now have laws in place that protect emotionally vulnerable young people from medical harm, thanks to your book and the work that came from that. I can't wait to see how the culture is going to change from this book, Bad Therapy. You make such a difference, and I so appreciate how you're empowering parents. We need it.
You guys are the best. I will talk to you anytime. Thank you so much. That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said about me. Thank you.
Thank you, Abigail. Thank you so much.
All right, take care.
Okay,
that was great.
That was so great.
I mean, the parent empowerment, the idea like, hey, let's just go assign kids more chores, give them more independence. Let's, subtract rather than try to add on all of these experts and therapies. This is what this generation and future generations of parents needed to hear. So excited about this.
Yes, I am too. And I want to also, just thank the audience. Those were great questions. Yeah. I know that I was bad and I did not get to all of them. So I am sorry I didn't get to all the questions I tried. And but really, I have a series of questions here, really brilliant questions. So thanks for your participation. We do have, let me see, where am I? We have some winners to receive her book, and IW Network will be in touch via email, but I'm going to read the names of the people who are going to get her book: Cynthia Dunlop, Beverly Rice, and Lynn Soplop.
Congratulations. You get,
let me read those again.
Very awesome book.
Yes. I'm sorry. That was so nice. That was a perfect prop. Again, Cynthia Dunlop, Beverly Rice, Lynn Soplop. So again, our team will be in touch with you via email to get that to you. Ginny, it's always fun co-hosting with you. I always love chatting with you as well. So thank you for co-hosting. Yeah.
Thanks for the opportunity. This topic was very important to me, so I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
It's important to all parents, and we are thrilled that you joined us today for the IWReads Book Club. We hope you enjoyed the book and our discussion. If you would like to get more involved with the Independent Women's Network, take a minute to become an investing member of the network. There is a pop-up. You can join IWN there. And it'll give you access to exclusive content, resources, and events like this one. Mark your calendars. We have an event on April 4th. That is media training. April 11th, an event on the Electoral College explained, and believe me, it can be complicated and it's helpful to have it explained. And then Friday, April 19th, Behind the Scenes of the War on Children with Landon Starbuck. That is a documentary that she and her husband produced a couple months ago. Really going to be a great conversation. Stay in touch with all of us by following us on social media, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Again, thank you so much for joining us. From all of us at the Independent Women's Forum Network, thank you.